Nurses of psych wards, what did a patient do that left you speechless? I was a certified nursing assistant for about 4 years, and the saddest experience ever was my client/resident constantly thinking I was her daughter. She went to Harvard and was an extremely brilliant lady in her time. She was nonverbal, but every time I walked into her room, she would exclaim, "Elizabeth, you came." I loved this lady so much, she would only eat when I fed her. She was extremely combative with everyone but me. I ended up quitting my job there but visited her every single day, to the point that her family kind of accepted me as their family. I finally found out that Elizabeth took her own life at 21, and the fact that she thought I was her gave her extreme joy. I never corrected her, and I like to think I gave her peace when she passed holding my hand. She was an amazing lady, and I miss her to this day. Sometimes you give baby dolls to dementia patients because it gives them an activity. Caring for and rocking a baby doll can have a calming effect and improve mood. I once had a patient in the later stages of vascular dementia who was very agitated. When not much else was working, we gave her a baby doll. She calmed down and started rocking the doll, and I went back to charting. Then I heard her start crying. I went around the desk to try and comfort her. I wasn't sure what was wrong, but patients just cry sometimes. When I sat down next to her, she said, "I know this baby is not real." Then she began sobbing inconsolably. I put my arm around her and let her cry. I just sat there with her, silently letting her cry. Not my favorite mental health story, but it was a literal time that a patient left me speechless. I'm not a nurse, but when I did an internship at an inpatient child psychiatric ward, we had a young boy who had all sorts of issues: bipolar, ADHD, sensory processing disorder. Most of the time he was bouncing off the walls, screaming, yelling, or flamboyantly acting out a scene from Singing in the Rain, his favorite musical. Despite his illnesses, you could still tell that he had this fun and amazing personality with a huge sense of humor and limitless creativity. But when they started him on Depakote, he would just sit there with his head down, coloring something. His mania was gone and his violent behavior was gone, but so was his humor, his creativity, his singing, dancing, and energy. Whenever I saw him that way, I had no words. It just killed me that such a young, bright kid had to go through what he was going through. Not a nurse, but worked on a combative unit in a nursing home as a certified nursing assistant and in the emergency department as a technician. Had a woman put me in a chokehold as I tried to transfer her from her wheelchair to her bed. A little old man used to sweet talk you, and then throw a punch when you were least expecting it. A married couple, 84 and 88 years old, shared a room. During 2 a.m. rounds, I walked in on them being intimate. They were both hard of hearing, so they didn't hear me come in. I just closed the door and let them do their thing. Walked in on an elderly man crushing grapes his family dropped off to make wine, while his roommate was drinking mouthwash to get drunk. A woman with dementia flushed her babies, stuffed animals, down the toilet repeatedly and would fight you if you tried to remove them. Maintenance was constantly called. The same woman pooped herself and walked into the head nurse's office and sat down. There was a poop trail from the day room to the nurse's office, poop on the nurse's chair, computer, keyboard, and last but not least, her cell phone. Had another woman refuse baths if the certified nursing assistant she liked wasn't working. This certified nursing assistant worked once a week. The woman hated everyone else and would throw anything she could reach at whomever came through her door. My professor, while we were interning at a psychiatric facility, told us a story about her most memorable experience with a psychiatric patient when she was still working at a hospital. The patient was a woman in her late 20s or early 30s. She was always isolated, and other nurses didn't interact with her. She was lovely, polite, and made great conversation. Though she was not allowed out of her room, and any time a nurse was to enter, they had to have male nurses present. Out of curiosity, my professor asked one of her coworkers why she was there and not allowed time outside because she seemed sane and docile. It turns out she was being held for a psychiatric evaluation because she had taken the lives of her husband and his relatives in a fit of madness. When my professor visited her that same night, the patient was standing facing the door and had a wide-eyed blank stare. In a monotone voice, looking straight through the window, she said in a low-tone voice, "Do you want to be next?" My ex-best friend was a psychiatric nurse. This young, early 20s, guy came in, in total psychosis. He was brought in by his parents. No history of mental illness, no family history of mental illness, and everyone said he doesn't do drugs. Of course, it's always a possibility, albeit a small one, that he took drugs for the first time and it triggered the psychosis, but everyone was adamant he didn't take anything. They admitted him. He hadn't talked to anyone. Since he had come in, he was just sitting, staring at a wall, and murmuring things like, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I did that when you said stop. I'm sorry." When anyone asked him what happened, it was like he couldn't acknowledge anyone was there. My friend and her colleagues were at a loss. He had no history of violence, so no one knew what he was talking about. He was there for a day or so when all of the nurses got called into the doctor's room for an emergency meeting. Under no circumstances were any of the nurses allowed to go into his room without one other nurse and security. Why? Because everything from here on out would become testimony, and they think they knew why he had such sudden psychosis. His live-in girlfriend was missing. She had tried to break up with him a couple of days before he was admitted. She still to this day hasn't been found, and he was transferred to another ward after that. This might not fit perfectly, but I love this story. How about in an inpatient addiction clinic? The first one that comes to mind was something I witnessed between a patient and another floor technician. We had a man who was in serious detox, and his drug of choice was meth. He was throwing a huge tantrum, not uncommon in delirium tremens. People will do just about anything to get a fix. We weren't a locked facility, so it wasn't like he was stuck there. He genuinely wanted help, that's why he stuck around, and we were there to listen and help him through the shakes, hallucinations, and other symptoms. He was slamming his fists on the desk at this point, and he had started just yelling, "I just want some ice." Slang for crystal meth. Well, the technician with me was inexperienced, although much older than me, and while I talked to him and tried to calm him down, she went back to our staff kitchen and got him a glass of ice. Like, frozen water. She brought it out to him and put it in his hand like, problem solved, and the guy just froze with confusion, staring at it. The patient and I both realized at the same time she thought he wanted ice, and we just started laughing. He was in for a rough couple of days, but I've never seen someone jump from a near psychotic episode to giggling so fast. We had an older lady who would walk up and down the ward constantly mumbling. It never stopped. I think she would get something like Thorazine to calm her down, but she would fight it and her eyes would be all droopy. She'd slow down, but she kept going. Nobody understood a word she said, and she was there for at least over 6 months. She was punched out once by a patient while he was on the phone because she kept walking by ranting. He just lost it. Anyway, I'm up there doing a patrol one day, I was security, and she's ranting and walking up and down the ward as usual. They call her to come get her meal. She sits down, opens her tray, stops ranting, and states clear as day, "I didn't order no diabetic tray, bitch." Every last person turned to her, and all of our mouths were wide open. That was the only thing she ever said clearly. A resident at a mental health halfway house had an obsessive eating problem. We had to keep anything edible out of sight, otherwise, he'd devour it. Someone left the door to the kitchen unlocked. There were some rolls on a pan left to rise, and the resident shoved one in his mouth. It got stuck in his throat as it expanded, and he lost his life. Also, same facility but at one of their satellite homes down the street. It was the middle of the night when I heard a blood-curdling scream come from the basement where one of the residents had her room. I flew down there as fast as my legs could take me, only to see her shrieking horrifically at the stairs. She was pointing to a little piece of red fuzz on one of the carpeted stairs. She thought it was a lobster. She had Down syndrome and was schizophrenic. Same lady whose voices told her to use a fork to remove one of her eyes. She liked to show off her glass eye she got as a result. Another resident, same satellite house, really upset after doing laundry. I asked what was the matter, and she said her clothes weren't drying. I asked what she was doing to dry her clothes. She had been putting in dryer sheets every few minutes when opening the dryer door. She thought they dried her clothes. She used an entire box of them. Not me, but my dad. This was in the 90s, and he was the overnight security of the psychiatric ward. There was this guy who had gotten kicked in the head by a horse, and the brain damage was far too aggressive. He could only have a mattress in his room since he would destroy everything else, and his door was only a half door since he couldn't figure out how to open it. Well, one night my dad and the other guard were sitting in their booth when they heard a door open. They looked up and saw this guy walking down the hall. He waved and smiled, saying, "Evening, just using the washroom." He used the washroom, walked back to his room, and went to bed. Turns out he would occasionally have moments of lucidity, but it was basically 90 out of 10. My dad only saw him lucid this one time, but other staff confirmed it was rare but happened. My dad said how sad it was because he had a daughter who would try to visit, but he'd never be lucid during those times. Just aggressive. When I was in nursing school, I had an interesting psychiatric rotation. I cared for this one girl that was my age. Terribly schizophrenic. We had her in isolation because she was attacking staff and just being completely out of it. She was unmedicated and isolated in her room at home for about 3 years because her parents were in denial about her illness. The night I had her, she was pacing around her observation room, an all-windowed room, in circles. That wasn't too weird, what I would expect honestly from most patients in there. At one point, she went into the corner and did the classic horror movie rocking back and forth, whispering to herself. She then urinated all over herself, took off her gown, cleaned up the mess off the floor, and then buzzed for a new gown. We brought a clean set in for her and left her to her own. She took the clean gown, tucked it neatly into bed like a small child, and then proceeded to put her dirty gown back on. She then sat in the corner and continued to whisper and rock. Our only hesitation from going in and helping her out was that she had brutally attacked one of the nurses earlier that day. She threw her food tray at her so hard that it shattered the window, went straight through to the nurse, and nailed her in the head. She needed about 8 stitches on her forehead. Eventually, we called security to get her changed, but I always think about that poor girl who became so ill because her parents denied there was such a thing as mental illness. I was working nights, and a new patient was upset because he kept getting bothered. He was too tired and injured to get out of bed. He kept using the call light to have us help him get the man in the hat out of the room. The room was empty. No other man. No hat. Just him getting more and more upset that this creepy man wouldn't leave the corner of his room and apparently alternated between talking at him relentlessly and just staring at him. He was highly medicated and had a history of hallucinations. He lost his life a few days later. Fast forward a few days. The first night of having a new patient in that room, I get some extra calls, and this patient is less angry and overall in a better mental state. She says she is settling in fine but just wanted to know who the man was earlier because they were having a great conversation, but he left. I had forgotten about the man in the corner from the week before, so I thought it was staff from the earlier shift. Trying to be helpful, I asked what he looked like. When she said she couldn't really remember because it was so dark where he was in the corner, and his hat was kinda making it hard to see his face, I got such goosebumps as I remembered the man from a few days before pointing to that same corner. To this day, when I think about it, it gives me chills. I am a psychiatric technician in a psychiatric ward. I have countless stories, but I'll just tell 2. We had a white patient who was convinced he was black and looked exactly like Michael Vick. He was a nice enough guy, but we were told explicitly to never tell him he wasn't black because he would get violent. He had hit a member of his group home staff with a brick when he told him he wasn't black. The hardest part was making sure the other patients didn't engage in the delusion. He was somewhat manic, but this delusion persisted whether he was manic or not. We had a girl who worked in a vet's office sneak in and 4-needle. When another staff member was doing patient checks, she found her in her bathroom filling up a cup with red liquid. This girl was not psychotic but clearly very sick. When a patient is at risk to themselves or others, we are allowed to go hands-on, either to a seclusion room or restraints. Patients who are a risk to others generally go to a seclusion room, an empty locked room with a mattress, and patients who are a risk to themselves go in restraints. These 2 options are the very last resort, and we will do every other option first: medication, distraction, de-escalation, etc. Overall, I love my job, but I meet some very sick people who do very strange things. In general, all the people I meet are very lovely once they get some help. It is a very scary situation to be out of your mind, and a little kindness can go a long way. Many of our patients are people who have self-harm issues and need a safe place to go. I encourage anyone who feels that way to come to an inpatient psychiatric facility. Most patients tell me they were very scared initially but are so glad that they came in. A 62-year-old demented female patient kept insisting there was a girl under her bed. This went on for months. Not unusual because of her multiple severe disorders. One night during med pass, I tried to reassure her she was safe, no one was under her bed, etc. Well, I crouched down to take a look like I have done 100 times before, and there was a neatly folded pink nightgown covered in floral print laying on the floor under the center of her bed. This was especially concerning because the facility is a really well-known state mental hospital, and the whole unit is completely locked down. The residents do not have any personal belongings due to the risk of self-harm. Housekeeping would have seen this gown on the floor during one of their shifts, surely. Also, this was not like the psych ward at your local community hospital, which tends to have a revolving door through which frequent flyers come and go. This was a long-term inpatient mental asylum. So there is literally zero explanation for how this piece of clothing got there. I held it up, and it's a strange shape and size, small enough to be a young girl's but not big enough for an adult. I inspected it and the whole floor with my charge nurse and director of nursing. Corridor security footage was reviewed, and we finally just said forget it and threw the thing away. It had this eerie feeling to it the whole time we had it, and one of the newer, more inexperienced nurses was so freaked out she quit without notice. Not the most exciting story, but there it is. I worked in the drug and alcohol rehabilitation ward. The majority of patients were alcoholic or cocaine users. We would also admit patients with acute mental disorders like anxiety, depression, and behavioral addictions like gambling, and just recently, gaming addiction. I was the nurse in charge of dispensing medication to the patients. The dispensary window was no bigger than a drive-through window, even smaller. One of the patients was due for their 4-hourly 20 mg dose of diazepam, Valium, to treat alcohol withdrawals. They would occasionally have a PRN dose depending on how intense the withdrawals were. Along with their scheduled 20 mg dose and another 20 mg PRN at 2 a.m., the patient was demanding more. After observations and assessment, we could not administer more until a few hours had passed. It was blatantly obvious they were exaggerating their withdrawal symptoms. After kindly telling them that we could not give any more, the patient, now enraged, attempted to climb their way through a tiny window, clawing at me, attempting to grab my keys for the medication room and the Schedule 4 and 8 medication safe. When that didn't work, they grabbed any nearby furniture and attempted to break the reinforced glass encasing the medication room with me inside. This dominoed into chaos as the other patients woke up angry, anxious, requiring medication for anxiety, triggered PTSD, and to get back to sleep. There was a moment where time stood still long enough for me to stare at the ensuing chaos and just accept it. I worked as a sitter in the psychiatric area of a hospital many years ago. Basically, I just sat outside the door reading books and coloring, making sure they didn't leave or hurt themselves. One guy was convinced that my tote bag, which had a book and my dinner in it, actually contained a gun. He lunged out of the bed toward me. I bolted and called for security. He grabbed the bag and threw it at me, then grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and chased me with it around the floor, which was conveniently a big loop. I was able to duck around a corner into a room with a door that locked as security showed up and held him down for the nurses to inject him with a sedative. I went back to my spot and watched him sleep the rest of the night. It was my first night on the job. Surprisingly, I went back the next night. I worked in a group home for teens, and one ended up in a psychiatric ward. She was a sweet young girl who had been there for about 3 weeks, plans for the future, would be staying with a relative she liked in a week, had friends, and had no history of issues whatsoever, aside from her mom kicking her out of the house for having a boyfriend, which she was understandably upset about. She went from sane to broken overnight. It was about 1 a.m. when I found her awake during checks, sitting on her bed and looking upset. She had become convinced she was pregnant, in spite of tests saying otherwise. Then the baby had been changed by chemicals. She was terrified of the baby inside her and the chemicals everywhere, changing everything. We couldn't seem to get her to realize she wasn't pregnant, couldn't be pregnant. And she would go on rants about chemicals, but it's hard to know exactly what she was talking about. Cleaners, pollution, medication, which she wasn't on. She talked about chemicals, getting in things the way some people talk about the devil. All strange, but still just borderline alarming. Then the clock started talking to her and telling her what to do, some of which involved burning herself and knocking her head against the wall. This is when we called authorities. She then basically became incoherent, in a word salad way, and was unresponsive to us, even when we got between her and the wall she was thumping. It was like we weren't there to her. When she was hauled away, about 4 hours after initial weird statements about how she was suddenly pregnant, she was in a kind of manic but also oddly passive state, again, like we weren't there, and was unable to walk. She had to be carried out on a stretcher. She was mentally somewhere else entirely. It was terrifying watching herself collapse so quickly and completely. Not a nurse, but I used to be a police officer. We got called to a psychiatric ward where a guy was smashing up his room. Okay, fair enough. We got there, and the room had plywood-based furniture attached to the walls and floor. It had a solid door with an inch-thick safety glass with wire in it. He had ripped apart every bit of furniture apart from the bed with his bare hands, ripped the lights from the ceiling, ripped the sockets out of the walls, this is in the UK, so proper old brick and plaster walls, and had smashed a hole in the door window. He had absolutely no weapons in the room and had done all this with his bare hands. I got there, and one of my colleagues was standing outside the door with a shield, and the patient was crashing into the door so hard that plaster dust was falling from the ceiling. He then managed to break through his window that led outside, also an inch thick, and got out onto the roof. They had to talk him down and eventually got him in, and a load of us escorted him to a room filled with only furniture made from foam and padding. The doctor gave him a powerful sedative and then quickly backed out the door while waiting for it to work. They took him to a psychiatric intensive care unit. I'll never forget the amount of damage he did. The room was sprayed with red liquid and looked like he'd smashed it up with a sledgehammer. He had only used his bare hands and the flimsy furniture. The insane thing was he was about 5 feet 6 inches max and looked about 140 pounds max. He was a small man, but his psychotic break gave him insane superhuman strength. My wife is a medical doctor and psychiatrist. Her story is about this one patient who had been placed under a psychiatric watch because he was showing signs of paranoia and claiming that his house had been bugged and his phone had been tapped. She was left speechless when the Federal Bureau of Investigation showed up to arrest him based on information they had gathered from the bugs in his house and the wiretap on his phones. She was even more offended and felt violated when they came to collect the bugs that they had planted in her workplace to listen in on what he had to say there after he had been placed there for psychiatric intervention. They insisted that they only ever listened to his sessions and didn't keep a record of anything else said in that office. ED nurse here, but our emergency department has a specific section for psychiatric emergencies, so this counts. The bathroom in this hall is right next to the guard's monitor, they share a wall. The bathroom also has one of those pass-through cabinets you use to give a urine sample at the doctor's office. Like this, anyway, one day we were dealing with a patient we knew well. Unfortunately, he had multiple complex psychiatric issues which led to him being with us quite a lot. He was mostly reasonable, but when he got angry, he'd be a handful. Well, one day, one of our doctors went in to speak with this patient and somehow made him really angry, and then walked out of the room. The encounter was over as far as the doctor was concerned. This led security to have to address this guy's behavior because he became aggressive and began throwing things/shouting, etc. He and the security guard got into it and weren't best of friends, to put it mildly. A few minutes later, he had to go to the bathroom. He walked in and was seemingly behaving himself. Then he yelled, "Surprise bitch," and threw his feces through this pass-through window straight at the guard. I obviously didn't show any reaction at the time, but I laughed until I cried after I'd walked out. I used to service scales. The new guy always got the care homes for the mentally unstable. First time in, 3 things occurred. First, I walked past this lady whose head was cranked sideways. Statue-like. As I got past, she made this horror movie curdling shriek at the top of her lungs. Almost dropped 500 pounds of lead weights out of my cart. Second was when I was working on a scale, checking wiring, etc. I realized this guy was standing inches behind me, watching, looking at me, watching what I was doing. He looked at me as he pushed closer to my work and asked me how the bomb was working out. He got shooed off by a nurse. Third one was about a minute later. A dude, mid-40s, suddenly appeared in the middle of the hallway, without any clothes, on his bed, rowing it down the hallway, evil grin on his face, staring right at me as he went by. Again, a nurse shouted down the hallway, "Frank, back to your room." His face instantly changed to sorrow, he hung his head, got out of his bed, and pushed his bed back to his room. Oddly, the first time was the only time I had anything come up. After many nice interactions, including Frank.